weeks, a national court for the
The 25th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order.
The General Assembly will assume its consideration of Agenda Item 74, entitled Report of the International Criminal Court, to continue the debate on the item. I therefore give the floor to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente, agradecemos.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the President of the International Criminal Court for the presentation of the report contained in A/78/222 that we have taken due note of. And we were able to see in that report the legal activities put forward by that body in fulfillment of its mandate, including current cases underway, the conclusion of some, and the status of investigations underway. Mr. President, the Venezuelan state is firmly committed, both in its national legislation and in practice, to the respect, promotion, and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And there we express our categorical rejection of all crimes committed against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, all of which are set forth in the Rome Statutes. We also reiterate the key role played by states as a guarantor of fundamental rights for their people and our further support for guaranteeing access to justice in those cases where such atrocious crimes have been committed, but always based on the premise of national jurisdiction having primacy. Venezuela reaffirms its firm commitment to the Rome Statutes and to fighting impunity, especially for crimes that are the most serious and internationally important. We believe that that is an unavoidable step, both for maintaining international peace and security and for strengthening the rule of law at the international level. Based on that commitment, we take this opportunity to first take note of the statements made by Prosecutor Ingar on the 29th of October, and secondly, to call for once and for all measures to be taken, urgently and concrete measures to be taken, including from the ICC, that Israel, the occupying power, be held accountable for the atrocious crimes that it has been committing for years with impunity in the occupied Palestinian territories. And that would include, throughout the last 3 weeks, another and regrettable spiral of violence, death, and destruction, which has cost the lives of thousands of civilian, innocent bystanders, including women and children, which can only be called, without making a mistake, a true genocide. Sir, in February of 2020, my country addressed the ICC for investigations to be conducted to investigate criminal responsibility of the members of the U.S. government who have perpetrated crimes of international importance against the Venezuelan people, with the application of a cruel and inhuman economic financial blockade and embargo, which prevents our people from having access to food and medicine. Through the systematic and intentional use of this embargo, it has become clearly a crime against humanity, according to Article 7 of the Rome Statutes. This is a whole series of unilateral coercive measures which violate the United Nations Charter and all norms of international law, and that are clearly geared to depriving all of the Venezuelan people from their means of subsistence. We await with interest the quick beginning of investigation into the case called the Venezuelan case. Despite our clear and manifest commitment to the Rome Statutes and the principles contained therein, and our actions of 3 years and our growing collaboration with the Karinkan office, despite all of that, we have to recognize it as is natural. On some occasions, there have been some discrepancies with the vision of the court or the prosecutor of the court when it adopted some of its decisions. However, that has not prevented us from continuing to cooperate and communicate in a fluid manner with the court. To the contrary, throughout the last few years, we have been strengthening our dialogue with the prosecutor's office of the ICC, and based on the recent signing in June of a memorandum of understanding by which we established a framework for opening an office of the prosecutor of the court in our country to provide technical assistance and to support the Venezuelan legislative efforts, which are geared to establishing the truth and providing justice. Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, on the 14th of August 2023, at the Appeals Court of the International Criminal Court, presented the basis of its case with regard to its appealing the preliminary findings, and through which was authorized a resumption of the investigation in the case called Venezuela 1. In the appeal, my country argued that on the 27th of June of 2023, there were errors in fact and in law in the report and the findings, misinterpreting international law and the Rome Statute, and therefore the result was contrary to justice and truth. With the presentation of our appeal, my country hopes that attachment will be shown to international law. According with our national constitution, Venezuela is a democratic and social state of law and justice. We therefore demand respect of our constitutional system of justice, and we also take this opportunity to recall that since at least 2018, we have been denouncing the process that was begun by a group of countries before the court, which is clearly politically motivated and can be inscribed in the strategy of trying to bring about a regime change. It involves foreign intervention in Venezuelan affairs based on false accusations and supposed crimes against humanity, something that has never happened in my country. In that context, it's worthwhile bringing to the attention of this General Assembly what was said by the ministers of foreign affairs of the non-aligned movement countries during its most recent meeting in July in Azerbaijan with regard to this question. And I quote, they said, "We note with concern the recent decision handed down by the International Criminal Court to proceed with an investigation into the presumed crimes committed under its jurisdiction in Venezuela based on the demonstrated cooperation with the ICC in this regard and the proceedings currently underway in Venezuela in exercise of its national jurisdiction and in keeping with its national obligations and international obligations as relevant. We further stress that this action is in violation of the principle of complementarity as set forth in the Rome Statutes, and therefore we request the ICC to avoid allowing its work to be politicized or used, and that would include as part of the loafer efforts or legal war, promote specific agendas and undermine efforts to preserve the integrity of the Rome Statutes and the independence of the court, end of quote. Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela reaffirms that the International Criminal Court is a court of last instance, and it establishes justice for serious international crimes rooted in national courts. National authorities, therefore, have the major responsibility of investigating and trying crimes which are defined as crimes in the Rome statutes. The court is involved, the ICC is involved only when states are not prepared to or cannot act within their jurisdiction to undertake the national proceedings that correspond to them. I would like to conclude by emphasizing that my country, through the public ministry, which in addition to guaranteeing respect for constitutional guarantees and judicial proceedings, organizes criminal cases and proceedings when crimes have been committed, has been undertaking a series of reforms. It has adopted a series of innovative measures to ensure effective justice be served on national territory, and always seeking to provide reparations to potential victims of human rights violations. All of this is in full compliance with our national and international obligations in this area, and those that would include those that stem from the Rome statutes, and in full correspondence with the spirit of cooperation, the memorandum of understanding undersigned between the ICC and my country. Moreover, we take this opportunity to recognize the work of public defenders who work at the ICC, whose efforts are fundamental to guarantee the proper functioning of the court. And we would also like to express our grave concern given the current labor situation of those public servants, and we therefore urge the government of the Netherlands, in its capacity as host of the ICC, to recognize their condition and return to the prior situation prior to 2014, whereby the taxation was similar to this other civil servants of the ICC in equal conditions. We also call for preservation of the objectivity, independence, non-selectivity, and impartiality and transparency of the work of the court. And we should avoid that it be used to advance dark political interests that run against the spirit of the Rome Statute and that undermine both the primacy of justice and human rights. Along these ideas, we conclude by rejecting in the most categorical terms the recent statement made by the United States in this very room 2 days ago. That statement shows once again the double standard applied in the area of human rights and its reiterated interest in politicizing the work of the ICC, whose judges and prosecutors have even been sanctioned due to the simple fact that they have tried to undertake investigations which are geared at specifically doing what other situations require, which is to provide justice and accountability for atrocious crimes. It's unthinkable, Mr. President, to try and supposedly promote great causes around the world while at the same time one chooses to turn a blind eye to the crimes committed by one's own nationals around the world, and then continue perpetuating over time impunity and a framework of impunity for the social genocide and oppression of an entire other people. This is not moral, and they do not stand on the moral high ground to make such statements about my country. It's enough to see so much shamelessness by the government of the United States and its satellites. It is time, therefore, to have justice and truth. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now invite the distinguished representative of El Salvador to take the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The Republic of El Salvador thanks the President for presenting the annual report on the work of the International Criminal Court. And with regard to the report, El Salvador would like to make the following remarks. The creation of the International Criminal Court was a crucial step in the evolution of international criminal law. This court reflects the commitment of the international community to guarantee that those crimes that are the most serious for the international community as a whole not enjoy impunity. 25 years after adopting the Rome Statute for the ICC, El Salvador takes note of the work of this important court in international criminal justice. We urge preservation, always, the institution as one that is permanent, independent, and of universal vocation. We further urge respect of the principle of complementarity in national jurisdictions. This principle makes it possible for the ICC to intervene when states cannot or are not prepared to try those who are responsible for serious crimes. In this regard, my delegation acknowledges that complementarity is essential to guarantee that there is no space for impunity and to adopt measures which are key for the protection of witnesses and victims. Mr. President, the relationship between the International Criminal Court and the United Nations is fundamental. The United Nations is the cornerstone of international cooperation, and the ICC has become a key and essential part of that structure. In that regard, my delegation takes note of the presentation of the reports A/78/322 on the work of the court in the years 2022 and 2023. We also take note of report A/78/321 on the expenditures and reimbursements received by the United Nations with regard to assistance provided to the ICC. We take note also of report A/78/320, which contains information which is relevant to application of Article 3 of the relationship agreement between the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. El Salvador encourages the promotion of capacity building in programs for legal reform and judicial reform supported by the United Nations in order to strengthen the institutional capacity and technical capacity of states parties to the Rome Statute, and also to train legal professionals geared to investigation and prosecution of international crimes. Capacity building clearly will make it possible to exercise the vital responsibility of states parties to the statutes to be able to investigate and try those crimes that are defined in the Rome Statute. And then, therefore, we believe it's opportune and very timely, the recommendations set forth in paragraph 71 of the report A/78/322 in this area. Mr. President, we conclude reiterating my country's commitment to continue reviewing this item of the agenda. And we would also like to join in the co-sponsorship of the resolution that will be adopted after the plenary debate has been concluded. We will continue to provide follow-up to the work of the court that will make it possible to guarantee in its fulfillment access to international criminal justice so that it is respected and put in practice in a way that is lasting and in a way that prioritizes protection of human dignity of victims. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of El Salvador, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to deliver her statement.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, a number of delegations have spoken here in this room about those lofty ideals, combating impunity and equality of all before the law. We support these principles. They're the right ones. Historically, my country has championed these principles. It was one of the countries behind the Nuremberg Tribunal. Russia was one of the most active participants in the development of the ICC's Rome Statute. We voted in favor of its adoption, we signed it, and we even began ratifying it. Like many others, back then, we genuinely believed that this court, the ICC, can continue the glorious legacy of the tribunals which were established following World War II with a view to condemning Nazi and militaristic criminals. The ICC was supposed to investigate the most serious crimes under international law. It was supposed to do so impartially and effectively. Very high hopes were pinned on the court by many. Most of the effusive language contained in the resolution we're considering today dates back to the first few years after the ICC was established. Back then, commendatory reviews were often given in advance, and yet they have little to do with the current situation at the ICC and around it. Time and practice have shown that the lofty ideals of justice were not destined to become reality. Hopes, it turns out, were far removed from reality. The trajectory of the ICC's development, or rather of its degradation, was very similar to the dubious achievements of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is famous for its clear anti-Serbian bent in its guilty verdicts. It's also known for whitewashing war criminals, including true butchers from a number of parties to the conflict. And it's only now that exotic courts of some sort established by the European Union, it's only now that they've started looking into these criminals. The ICC's main achievement is that it managed to outdo the odious ICTY in terms of how selective, partial, and politicized its work is. It's also excelled in brushing under the carpet the war crimes committed by its Western masters. Already back in Yugoslavia, Hague justice was a dirty word, and it's taken on new meaning thanks to the ICC. The ICC managed to refute the idea that combating impunity was a guarantee of reconciliation and conflict resolution down the line. The situation in Sudan and Libya is an excellent example of this. Experiments to transfer these situations to the ICC, these dossiers to the ICC, were not only unsuccessful, they meant a catastrophe for these countries, which stretched out over many years. Over the time that the ICC has been doing its useless work, we have a pathetic handful of decisions. The final verdict, well, you can count the number of final verdicts on one hand, on the fingers of one hand. Many cases simply fell apart at the investigation's stage, and billions of dollars were spent on these less than impressive results. The ICC's regular budget, a punitive machine wielded by the collective West, its budget is 3 times higher than that of the International Court of Justice, and this is without counting the hundreds of millions of dollars which Western countries funneled into that sham Ukraine case in the guise of voluntary contributions. Against this backdrop, the ICC's regular attempts to justify in front of the Security Council its flagrant years-long ineffectiveness on Libya and the Darfur justify this because it doesn't have sufficient financial resources. Well, that's a pitiful excuse. And yet, the West has certainly got bang for its buck. Since the ICC was established, 52 persons were charged. 47 of them were from Africa. That's a very interesting statistic, given that the worst, the bloodiest mass atrocities in modern-day history were committed by the West. An African colleague referred to the ICC as the International Colonial Court, and it wasn't in jest. The ICC has degenerated into a truly political tool for prosecuting those who have crossed the West. The neocolonialists, meanwhile, are enjoying total impunity, regardless of what they do, and this is in the best traditions of the so-called rules-based order instead of the law-based order. And examples abound. This court and its pet prosecutor, a British national, well, the West simply had to snap its fingers, and the court deprioritized an investigation of civilians dying at the hands of NATO, including women and children. Similar situations in Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of victims, and yet no one is held responsible. That's the justice you get at The Hague. And in a similar fashion, the ICC is making up cases as soon as its Western patrons tell it to. For instance, the arrest warrant issued against Mr. Gaddafi, which was cooked up in a matter of 3 days. These were shameful instances. cases are fabricated against states which are not to the liking of the Western patrons of the ICC. The Gaddafi case was so outrageous that even the test tube wielded by Mr. Powell at the UN Security Council pales in comparison. And yet the ICC did its job. It dehumanized the Libyan leader, creating a fig leaf for the NATO aggression in the country. As a result, the country and its economy lie in ruins. Mr. Gaddafi was killed, and no one was held to account for this. Many perished from NATO bombs. Hundreds of thousands of people went up in flames during the civil war, a war of all against all. Many drowned at sea, heading to Europe, looking for a better life. Or some did make it ashore and saw outrageous discrimination and inhumane treatment on the part of those who destroyed their home country. And who has been held responsible for this? We see total impunity at the ICC. So-called arrest warrants were issued for a number of Russians hastily just before the Russia-China summit. And this was a shameful circus. It doesn't have anything to do with justice. And the pretrial chamber actually had to replace the judge very quickly. In fact, when the prosecutor sent his request to the court, to the chamber's composition had been finalized. But who cares about procedural norms when you have political orders to execute? The prosecutor got his bonus, by the way. Just a few days before he sent his request to the ICC, his younger brother was released from prison. This was early release. His brother was a former British MP who was serving time because of a paedophilia crime. The issuance of warrants happened days before the donor conference in support of the ICC in London, and the sponsors there said that all of the money they were pledging should be spent exclusively on holding Russia to account. In other words, interested parties are paying for the proceedings they commission. Just think about this. What justice is there to speak of? The charges brought against Russians, that's a whole other issue. Not only are they groundless, there are violations of international law on the immunity of state officials. They're nugatory in legal terms and inhumane. These Russians are being accused of evacuating children who had been left to their own devices from an area where hostilities are underway. So if we follow the ICC's logic, we should have left these children in the line of fire. This is how the ICC believes justice should be done. Against this backdrop, it comes as no surprise the ICC's position and the position of its patrons regarding the tragic events which have been ongoing now for 3 weeks. The civilian population has not been evacuated from the area where hostilities are underway. Thousands of children have died owing to indiscriminate shelling. Hospitals are being shelled regularly. Patients, doctors, and emergency workers are being buried under the rubble. Hundreds of people are suffering due to lack of water and medicine. Some UN system agencies have woken up and have started talking about possible war crimes. Where is the much wanted ICC? Where are the arrest warrants? Or are those issued only when you save children, not when you kill them? The office of the British prosecutor is making some general political pronouncements, threatening taking Palestinians only to court. This again demonstrates the true nature of the ICC, its ideals, the purposes it pursues, and the interests, whose interests it's serving. Thus, the ICC's attempts to position itself as a body acting on behalf of the international community that look simply silly. The idea that has an international generally recognized mandate has nothing to do with reality. It's divorced with reality. This is a pseudo-court. And in fact, over 1/3 of UN member states are not members of it. They represent over 50% of the Earth's population. Many have been compelled to stay at the ICC because they've been threatened. So we've had an overview of the ICC's work. Let's compare the situation, this unsightly picture, with the draft resolution. The document has been frozen since 2016. Any links to reality were severed long before. In 2011, this pseudo-court signed its own death sentence when it came up with those fakes regarding Mr. Gaddafi. Most of the positive assessments of the ICC's work were included in the resolution back then when it was being established, before it had started its work. In fact, this is probably the only golden days the ICC has known in its history. Aside from the scandalous exterior, the situation within the court is just as problematic. It's completely opaque, the elections process is dubious, and there is no equal geographical representation. All of the top positions are invariably occupied by Westerners and their satellites. They're doing everything within their power to stop developing countries succeeding to the helm of this repressive political instrument wielded by the West to fight against those who are not to their liking. Another issue is the link within the resolution between the ICC and the UN. It does nothing for the credibility of the UN. The panegyric resolution under the GA's consideration stopped reflecting reality long ago, including because showing the true state of play in the text is simply impossible because of the implacable position of pro-ICC activists. This is what the ICC has degenerated into. And we do not intend to live with this text, even in its frozen form, any longer. We don't want the GA to remain hostage to idealistic views, which have been refuted by reality over the course of the ICC's 20-year decay. We demand to put the draft resolution to a vote. We call on all states which are not indifferent to genuinely combating impunity, who are in favor of equality and the sovereign equality of states in particular, to join us in voting against this resolution. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and now invite the observer state of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. In all of 2022, across all conflict areas around the world combined, around 3,000 children were killed. 3,000 too many. In 3 weeks, Israel killed 3,600 Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip, more than all the children killed in all conflict areas in a year. Of the 8,800 Palestinians killed so far, more than 70% are children and women. Nearly all are civilians. Is there anyone here, anyone with a shred of humanity and decency, that thinks there is any justification for that? Anyone here that believes these numbers are possible if Israel was not targeting civilians, or at the very least, conducting indiscriminate attacks? The rules of international law came in response to tragedies we failed to prevent. We remember the names of these tragedies. They are the names of towns, cities, provinces, forever etched in our collective memory as open wounds, as stains on humanity's conscience, as reminders of what happens when the worst occurs and the many remain silent. In that list, Gaza's name is in bold. It appears several times. For the decades of military occupation, for 16 years of blockade, for 5 wars, and now more than ever, for 3 weeks, where the Gaza Strip has been besieged and bombed with no regard for the life of 2.3 million Palestinians who live there. The international community has failed those who were killed. It is failing the besieged, the wounded, the sick, the displaced. But thousands of lives hang in the balance. They can still be saved. There is no way to describe what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip as anything else than war crimes. Let me reformulate. There is no way to describe what is happening as anything less than war crimes. If you recognize these acts are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, these are crimes against humanity. If you recognize they are committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national group, then they are genocide. These are the choices. Genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes? Which one does any country here wants to try and justify? Is there any country still ready to evoke unconditional support for Israel while it is committing these atrocities, while it is occupying, colonizing, besieging, killing, and maiming? As member states of the United Nations, you pledged unconditional support to the UN Charter, to the rule of international law. Every nation has to choose where its loyalty lies. What is clear is that support for Israel in this war is incompatible with that pledge, with your obligation to uphold international law. International law, as a leading humanitarian NGO puts it, the humanitarian rule book has been thrown out, and polite pleas from politicians to minimize civilian fatalities are naive at best, and at worst seem blind to the unimaginable horrors already taking place in Gaza. International law is the standard against which all our actions are measured. Condoning double standards can only undermine and jeopardize the credibility and rule of international law. No exceptionalism for Israel, and no exception for Palestine and the Palestinian people. You know how what is happening in Palestine now is possible? One wonders, looking at these images, how is this possible? Not for one day, not for two, for days and weeks now. Live on TV screens being broadcasted around the world, massacres taking place. You know how it is possible? Read the Rome Statute. It has all the answers. It states, determined to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes, and thus contribute to the prevention of such crimes. Impunity leads to recurrence of crimes. 75 years, not a single Israeli leader or commander or soldier has been held accountable for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. Not one. We joined the ICC almost 10 years ago and still await for justice to be delivered. There were countries to oppose us joining the ICC. There were countries to oppose the General Assembly seizing the International Court of Justice. How can they explain why Israel can never be held accountable in any form or any forum? This is not what history taught us. It taught us that our